Hi, this is The Philosophical Angle, and I am your host, Chris Angle. I am the author of 4 books on philosophy, one of which is The Nature of Aesthetics. These books are available free for viewing online at www.philosophypublishing.com. Along with me are 2 of our panelists, regular panelists. One is Dr. Mark Brennan. Mark is the professor at the Stern School of Business at New York University. And Rick Samuelson. Rick graduated from Yale, has an MBA from Wharton and an MA from Tufts. He's an independent investor and retired from the investment banking industry. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
The purpose of The Philosophical Angle is to examine the nature of the concepts being used in current media and compare these essences with the concepts in how they're being used. Let's start today by what's being discussed in media regarding the AP and Fox News reporters going under surveillance of the government, and whether this is an okay thing for the government to do. Well, let's start. First, I guess we have to start at the core of things and ask ourselves, what is the nature of news reporting? Obviously, a reporter seeks news from a source, and that source will divulge it, and once it's divulged, the story becomes created by the reporter and published by whatever news company that he's working for. And this goes for any news source, whether it's government or private. The story then will become a story on either private companies or individuals, or the story could be about the government. The courts over time have said that this is okay, that reporters, it's the natural function of a reporter to seek stories. And in this case, as Eric Holder related, it was a very bad leak, as he stated. I don't know how bad of a leak it is, but nevertheless, he stated it's a bad leak. But the courts have said that this is the job, to seek out information on the government. And they can publish it. In fact, a few years ago, when President Bush was in office, he once called the New York Times and asked them to not publish a certain story. They ignored him and went ahead and published it. No consequences came about. So the courts have said pretty much throughout their history that this is okay, that reporters are doing what they do naturally, and it's essential to a free society, because otherwise there would be no checks on government information and whistleblowing, and we'd all have to get all of our information from the government by asking the government and getting whatever that they would divulge on their own will. So I'm not sure, and I would say it probably does not square with the First Amendment and with the society that we have lived with since the founding of the United States. So, but this time the government objects because it was stated to be classified information. Companies and individuals can also object to stories being written because they might say that it's proprietary. They might say it's, or for some other reason, defamation. So, what is the defining criteria that we can put in place to understand the nature of this reporting? In other words, how far does the nature of free speech go? And thus, how far does the First Amendment protect free speech? It was stated that obviously there are limits, because you can't scream fire in a public theater, for example. And the reason is that, one, the yelling is an unethical action, and it also has an unethical objective, and that objective is to cause panic within the theater. So the courts have said screaming fire in a crowded situation obviously is not protected by the free speech, because it has an unethical action and it's got an unethical objective. And that is the very definition of evil. And so I would purport that the limitations of free speech are until we run it up against evil, and there we find its limitation. Well, within this definition of evil, we have to also understand what is ethical. And ethics is the appropriate dispensation of respect. So obviously, if you're yelling in a theater, fire, you're not giving your fellow viewers in the theater respect to the appropriate amount that they should receive, and that you're trying to cause them harm, which is also an unethical action. Being it, giving them, having no respect for your co-inhabitants within the theater. Okay, with this idea presented, let's go to our panel and seek responses from our guys about this situation of the AP and Fox News reporters being the subject of surveillance and wiretapping by the U.S. government. Mark, you're an historian. Let's start with you. Any response, any comments about this surveillance that's happening?
My guess is that in this case, this is just the first time they've been caught. They're probably doing it all the time.
Okay, so, but we need to get to some sort of conclusion as to whether it should be permitted, whether the government should be permitted to survey or produce surveillance on reporters, or for that matter, citizens who aren't even reporters.
Well, you know, it's funny, Chris. They talk in such sacrosanct terms about the right to privacy when it has to do with either contraception or abortion. But here it doesn't matter. So I see an inconsistency. But I think the larger part of this argument is subsumed by constitutional issues that probably none of us are qualified to discuss.
Well, I would like to take issue with that statement. Just because we are not a constitutional lawyer doesn't mean we can't understand the philosophy behind the Constitution, which rests in John Locke, which all of us can read, as well as any lawyer or anybody else. And our understanding.
Oh, yeah, my point was that the U.S. Constitution poses no threat to our current form of government.
Say that again. I'm not sure I understood the statement.
The U.S. Constitution poses no threat to our current form of government. We don't live in a constitutional republic. We use the Constitution the way England uses the Queen. When they need to revert back and make a point, they wheel her out and stick her in front of a crowd and say, "Oh, remember, we're a constitutional monarchy." But we do the same thing. We just don't live by the Constitution until it annoys somebody, and then somebody pulls it out and says, "Hey, wait a minute, you're breaking one of the rules we have here." and then we put it back in and we go break 50 more rules, like declaring, fighting undeclared wars that have not been declared by Congress, and every other social program that's been proposed by the Republican Party since Nixon took office.
Okay, so we're ignoring the Constitution. Rick?
No, the Constitution doesn't apply to this country anymore, is what I'm saying.
Okay, it's being totally ignored, I guess, then.
Yeah.
Rick, any thoughts?
Well, in the case of the Fox News reporter, I think his name was Rosen, he's, if I remember correctly, being accused of espionage, effectively. To argue that that's not over the top when applied to a reporter who's simply doing his business, I think is silly. In a larger context, one is surprised that more efforts aren't made by, this government to police the sources of the leaks. You would think that that would be where their efforts would be focused, but instead, they've chosen to direct their ire at the press. So I think it's of a piece with a government mentality that is trying to control, as the Obama administration seems to be trying to control, every element of political dialogue and how it is represented to the public. And I would say the IRS revelations are part of that too. So, I see this, and I tend to agree with Mark. This is probably the first time they've been caught. They've been doing it a lot because they were doing it a lot at the IRS and not caught until recently. So I suspect this is part of a larger plan, frankly, on the part of the Obama administration, and well orchestrated. And it needs to be rooted out. Simple as that.
Yeah, you just brought up the, I think you just talked about the Espionage Act. And yeah, that is the statute known as 793E, and has been vexing reporters and lawyers for decades. And I guess it was updated in 1950 by over a veto of President Truman. The statute criminalizes the willful retention of unauthorized national defense information. And it was first drafted in 1917. So, but does this actually go into national defense information? Is it okay for a reporter to question a government official about some overseas, and I guess it was about, I guess it was in 2009 that this happened, against, from a government employee involving information of North Korea. And so this is the main argument. Could this statute override the historical precedent set by the courts which referred to the First Amendment? What's stronger, the statute or the First Amendment? Any opinions?
I think the First Amendment should be stronger. It's a slippery slope when you start criminalizing the press. And going back to the example Mark cited, where Bush attempted to get the New York Times not to print something, I think that is the position the government should be in. They can police their own people. Like if you work for somebody, you have to play by their rules. And those members of the government who engage in leaks are subject to the laws under which they operate. But to criminalize the press for releasing information that was voluntarily shared is obviously a very slippery slope.
Right. I agree, and but nevertheless, I think we have to go to some criteria, because at some point that slippery slope might become so steep as to cause harm. For example, you can't scream fire in a crowded theater, so if obviously the outcome is going to create great harm, I think the press would be requisite in the press to withhold at least some of the information that would cause that great harm, especially if it's human life. And so maybe you could comment on that, guys. Do you think that that is a reasonable standard, that we could say that the First Amendment does have limitations, or does it not?
Chris, you're mixing something up here. The
Okay.
prohibition against screaming fire in a theater is in the case where there's not a fire. And I think you're also talking about, releasing government information that could lead to people dying, where the underlying facts are in fact facts and true. So the press is not allowed to just make things up that are going to lead to
Right.
people's death.
Obviously.
And at the same time, you would think that the press, if it were patriotic, would have a patriotic duty not to put the United States at risk, its people, its interests, whatever. But I'm under no delusions that there's even a scintilla of patriotism in any of the press, and they are now run by, large corporations. And if you abide by Wendell Berry's definition of a corporation, which I do, he said that a corporation is nothing more than a big pile of money whose sole reason for existence is to become bigger. So when you mentioned before the ethical aspects of this, remember you have an agent principal problem here, and corporations that are now running the press are really in it for one thing, and that's to make money. They're not doing any kind of patriotic duty for anybody, despite all the bloviating and blathering on Fox News.
Well, I can certainly agree with that, and I think the history of the press agrees with it also, going right back to the muckrakers and their will to sell papers. Rick, any?
Well, it's even better in times of war. The best example is the sinking of the Maine in Havana Harbor. The Yellow Press, the ship basically blew up. It had nothing to do with a Spanish or Cuban attack, and you've seen it time and again. The press is rushed to judgment to sell papers, and you sell more papers in a time of emergency and national panic, which is oftentimes in times of war. You mentioned the Espionage Act. People scream bloody murder about that because that came out during the Red Scare. So you'll get objections to even bringing that up.
Rick, what about this limitation of the First Amendment and the? Can there be a limitation put on the First Amendment and free speech within this society, and still be adherent to our founding fathers' wishes?
I think the instances are rare, far and few between, because as soon as you start putting limitations on the First Amendment, where do you draw the line, right? And the worst part about it is it plays into the hands of any government that always seeks to control the flow of information to the public. I take your point. You don't cry fire in a theater, in a public theater, where there's imminent danger for the persons there. But if these are true facts that have been voluntarily released to the press, and if the press decides to go ahead and publish them, despite pleas from the government not to do so, it is their right to do so.
Well, I agree with that, absolutely. Especially in this case, or in the cases that are present before the media. there was no great danger or clear danger involved in these circumstances that I'm aware of. So I absolutely agree with you that they should have, and they did well in publishing what they did. So you guys, too, probably agree that in this case for the AP and the Fox News reporter Rosen, they were followed by and surveilled by the government in an egregious manner. Do you agree with that?
I mean, worse than that, there's intimidation. There's an implicit intimidation going on here, right? As soon as you start citing, counter-espionage, I mean, doesn't that logically send a chill throughout the press and the broader public when it comes to saying anything about the government? I mean, this is intimidation as well, and that's unjust too.
Yeah, I agree. And so should there be penalties or a reprisal against the government for such an unethical action on their part against the reporters?
The Attorney General should resign.
Should that be the conclusion of the matter, or should there be more to pay for? In other words, should the penalty for the government's egregious behavior be more severe than just a resignation of the Attorney General?
I would start by having Holder resign. You should have done it last week.
I certainly agree with that. Mark, what do you think about penalties for the government? Is it a
I don't know who officially should resign, below Holder, but there should also be some incentives and structures in place to prevent this from happening in the future, and reminding people of the sanctity of the press and the reasons Rick pointed out why we want to have an active and inquisitive press, unlike what we have today.
And what would be the nature of those sanctions? Do you have any suggestions how actually that could be carried out? And what magnitude could they be?
Yeah, I mean, they should be severe so that people do not do this again. My definition of severe and the ACLU's definition of severe are radically different, but let's just leave it at severe.
Okay. And when you say severe, is it against them personally, or against the government as the government, or against the actual individuals personally?
Against the actual individuals. Fining the government is meaningless. Ultimately, you could just print the currency to pay the fine. It would have to be against the individuals as actors. There's no corporate veil like there is in corporate law. These people should be punished for breaking the law.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, whether they should be sought after personally. Of course, it also depends on what we really want to do is find out the person who created this policy of terror or intimidation, as Rick just mentioned, and go from there. Can anybody surmise how far up this will go in the ladder in the political chain, the political ladder?
Well, my guess.
I think Holder's signature was on the warrant,
there's a start.
Whether the underlings should be fired as well, I leave that up to the Justice Department. But Holder should go.
Right. As a tangent to our conversation presently, how far up do you guys think the IRS problem, speaking of intimidation, is? Where do you think that policy originated in the IRS against the Tea Party members, and it seems that it also went over to the ATF and OSHA because several of these companies were actually raided by those organizations also. So there seems to be some sort of coordination between the agencies, which means that it's above the agency that that is creating this policy. Any guesses how far we got to go up the ladder before we find its origin?
I would just again, this has probably happened many times in the past. We just don't know about it. But I would guess that there is a lot of plausible deniability, and people put firewalls between this scandal and themselves, even as they structured it and launched it to allow themselves to escape without being implicated.
Yeah. Rick, any final thoughts or comments?
Well, I would echo Orrin Hatch's remarks a few days ago, when it was discovered that the practices at the IRS were known in the White House. He didn't name the president, but it was discovered that it was known by the White House, members of the White House staff. His comment was, well, the possibility that Mr. Obama didn't know about this, at least in some form or to some extent, seems very, very remote.
Just a final thought, guys. Should that be the case, is the nation ready for retribution on such a policy being made?
Are you talking about impeachment?
Talking about retribution against an egregiously bad policy brought on to a voting public. Really, it was really to turn an election.
Well, I'm happy to comment if you'd be more specific by what you mean retribution, and who are we talking about launching this against?
Well, we'll have to continue it some other time. We're out of time here for this session, and I want to thank everybody for joining the Philosophical Angle, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.